everyone, welcome to today's episode of Wake the Future. Today we are going to talk about reverse mentorship. Now, particularly when it comes to AI, there's so much talk that we have to have as adults, so much oversight over the use of AI when it comes to kids. But today I want to flip that narrative and really think of what we as adults can learn from not just kids and their AI usage, but really look more closely at the attitudes that a lot of them have around it.
Yeah, and we've been talking about reverse mentorship for a long, long time. We've sat in rooms with CEOs and been like, one of the most important things in the future is adopting processes of reverse mentorship. And a lot of them are kind of like, what does that even mean? And it's this idea that instead of everything being top down, where you learn from your elders, whether it's in life or at work, it's the idea that we have something we can learn from younger people. They have a different perspective. They're more immersed in technology. For my interest today, we can look at some data points and maybe talk about some examples related to artificial intelligence. I'm more interested in adopting this mindset more broadly. So it's not just about AI, but it's about how do we integrate principles of reverse mentorship into our lives, into our businesses, so that we have a better understanding generally about how young people see the world. So instead of thinking about them as like kids these days, we actually view them as a real resource that might help us learn as we go through life.
We were talking the other day. I came across this article in MIT Technology Review. It's linked below in the comments. And the researchers basically just took hundreds of kids from across the country, like a pretty even cross-sampling of them, and just dug into how these kids use AI, how they view AI, how they think it's going to impact them in their lives. So here are just a couple of standout statistics that I gleaned from this piece, and then let's use that as a launching off point to talk more deeply about reverse mentorship. So these journalists interviewed kids starting at age 10, going all the way up to age 18. And the whole purpose was, how do you actually feel about AI? And what it came out with was the fact that it's much more nuanced. So here are some of the big picture findings. Reactions ranged from indifference to outright refusal to engage with AI at all. But then most of the kids interviewed admitted to using AI at least a little bit, right? There's some sort of baseline usage. You layer on top of this findings that came out of Pew recently, Pew Research, back in February, and they found that 57% of US teens had used chatbots to search for information, 54% for schoolwork help, and 47% for fun, but only 12% used chatbots for emotional support or advice, suggesting that teen AI use is more mundane rather than concerning. And the younger kids going down, for this study, they only looked at 10 and above, but for elementary and middle school age kids, generally, they're not really clamoring for AI the way that they might for social media or for iPhones. They're just using it already embedded in apps or in school tools. So they're not actively going on ChatGPT. And it was a pretty mixed bag. So about half of kids think AI will have an equally positive and negative effect on their futures. But then there's one other study I want to layer in, also linked below, and this came out of Common Sense Media. And it said more than 4 in 10 kids say no parent or guardian has even talked with them about AI safety. And 56% of parents or guardians said that they haven't even begun to discuss AI safety with their kids at all. So I thought that this MIT piece was really interesting because some of the kids were just kind of like meh about it, right? Like they didn't have strong opinions one way or the other, but also a couple of the older ones, right? The teens were saying, you know what, we have to be careful. And one kid in particular, and I was like, oh my God, I love this kid. I wasn't thinking that critically when I was 14, was talking about not deferring so much of their thinking to AI. So there's almost like this awareness of what AI can do and equally what it cannot do that many adults are still trying to figure out. But a lot of these kids are much more native to it. And that brings me back to the point about reverse mentorship.
As I said earlier, I love this because it gets the conversation started. I'm much more interested in how this applies much more broadly beyond AI. But I think AI is an interesting flashpoint right now, technologically. And, to a certain extent, you would talk about them being more native to this. They're young people are more native to a lot of technologies, but most of the use cases that are really, really, I think, interesting and that people are talking about in the marketplace when it comes to AI have to do with the workplace. And most young people are not in the workplace. They're either not old enough to be in the workplace or, we know what's happening with people in their early 20s and their kind of disrupted relationship with work. So to a certain extent, this is not one of those technologies that's just a consumer technology that young people are going to school us on. This is something that I think we're all learning to navigate at the same time. And to a certain extent, they're not using it at work at all. They might be using it in education, or they might be thinking about, how do I use this in education? Of course, the fear there is that there's going to be a lot of rampant cheating and a lot of kind of shortcuts taken. But you know what? Look, it's so early in the game with this stuff. What I'm more interested in, frankly, are their attitudes towards this. How do they feel about it?
So that was the biggest thing for me.
How do they feel about it? Like, are they optimistic? Are they pessimistic? Do they fully understand? I mean, you mentioned in there, as you're going through a lot of the nuances of this, that a lot of parents haven't even had safety conversations with their kids about this. But are we equipped to do that? Again, do we know more about this technology than our kids do? Do our kids know more about this technology than we do? Or my thesis on this is that we're all basically equally blind. We're all equally ignorant. This is such a new technology. It's accelerating so rapidly. I don't think any of us know where this is shaking out. So I don't even think I'm equipped. You might disagree with me here. I don't think I'm perfectly equipped to sit, for example, have a conversation with our 9-year-old son about all of the inner workings of AI and how he might be using it and what he should be looking out for when I don't fully understand it myself.
I just thought this was an interesting perspective because there's so much of a spotlight on Gen Z, and we've talked about the facets of Gen Z when it comes to job insecurity and the economic landscape and all of the threats of AI. But this conversation was different because, these kids are approaching it very neutrally. And a lot of them were even just expressing in their minds as Gen Alpha, it's like, all right, this is just a tool. And I think for some of them, they're viewing it like a tool no differently than how we viewed certain technological tools when we were kids. And the biggest thing, getting back to the whole point about reverse mentorship, is I've always said, it's like to have the humility and to have the curiosity to ask and like be an active learner in saying, what has hit the lives of these young kids way before it has even begun to trickle up and hit my life. And I think one of the biggest skill sets for any adult operating today, having that humility, and you've talked a lot about humility in other episodes, is the fact that we can say, you know what, we don't know everything. Maybe we are not the most well-equipped to then have conversations around safety. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them, but it has to be a dual dialogue, right? Like the streams have to flow in both directions. And to just approach it and say, you know what, talked about the fact that we all have to become not only lifelong learners, but lifelong forgetters. Such a core part of forgetting is all of that baggage that we've accumulated over time that we're like, you know what? How does a young person think? What is their worldview? How are they using this? So for me, like the fact that like 10 to 18-year-olds were profiled with such a different look at this, and we need to keep tapping into this generation more and more if we want to get a handle on where any of this is going.
I mean, there's so much there. You just said so much stuff. So let me unpack it one by one. I think first of all, you talked about them using it as a tool or viewing it as a tool. So when you think about young people viewing AI as a tool, we have to think about the context. I think in education, I'm jealous of them. I'm jealous that I didn't have tools like this when we were coming of age.
Why, we had graphing calculators and Cliff Notes.
We're not that old. We've made references to this in previous episodes. This probably comes up every 4 or 5 episodes where we talk about how unlucky we were because we were using graphing calculators, Cliff Notes, LexisNexis,
those were the bomb. I loved Cliff Notes.
Dewey Decimal System, the card catalog, all that crap. Research papers were a nightmare. You had hours and hours of research in the middle of the night when we were in college trying to get physical books and figure out how to piece together research. And now these kids have so many tools at their disposal. Yes.
Or you date an upperclassman and take their papers.
Yeah, exactly. We're not going to talk about which one of the two of us did that. Hint, I'm older. So basically, but here's the thing, like, yes, on the negative side of the ledger, can that theoretically lead to what the fear is, which is more cheating and more plagiarism? And I know people personally who are dealing with this with their kids. So I'm not pushing that under the rug. But the flip side to that is that there are so many more efficiencies. Like kids who are learning these days, in theory, have the ability to now focus their attention on what they need to focus their attention on, less on some of the grunt work we used to have to do. That's in the learning environment. Then you take the work environment where their experience is minimal to zero. So is it a tool in the work environment? Absolutely. And I think their attitude, and I think this is going to come out more and more over the coming years, is going to be one that is at best, it's probably agnostic plus into the positive for a tool in their life. I think it's going to be viewed as agnostic, if not a negative, as a tool in the professional space, because they're going to view it as a proxy for their own employment. And this is a natural human kind of metabolic response to what's happening right now, which is the idea that if these things keep being deployed in the workplace, I, as an entry-level employee, am not going to be useful anymore. So I'm not going to get hired. So I think that there's going to be more nuance if we revisit this in a couple of years. But the bottom line, and I think we should do a near future episode on this, because I've been talking to you about this. I think there's a real leadership conundrum in the corporate world as it pertains to AI. There's a crisis of sameness. People aggregating to a mean, not willing to be risky in the decisions they're making. So they're all making similar decisions about adoption of AI. and they're not always asking the right questions about why or how, which is why so many people are failing. And I do believe we're going to need bold leadership in the future where real leaders are going to differentiate by making risky bets. They're going to zig instead of zagging. And one of the ways that a visionary, bold leader can zig instead of zagging, like everyone else is doing, is to really integrate reverse mentorship into the DNA of a business. It could be a 5-person business. It could be a 5,000-person business. How do we take our youngest, highest potential people, or even our family members who we talk to at dinner every night around the kitchen table, the whole gestalt of Wake the Future? How do we tap that wisdom and say, okay, we're not going to sit here and be like kids these days anymore as this kind of like monolithic demographic, but instead you're shaping the future. I need to know how you're feeling about this. I need to know how you're going to kind of approach the future. And if you're an employee of mine, well, then I better know how you're viewing this, because that's what's going to matter going forward. So reverse mentorship needs to be integrated into the DNA.
That any employee or any intern is already too old. So to go even younger. And I go back to the point. It's like, what has started to hit their world, as asinine as you might think it is, as trite and silly as you might think it is.
But isn't that cyclical? Every generation, older generations think the things the younger people are doing is trivial, asinine, questionable, weird.
Yes, but now the point is the speed.
Yes.
So it's the speed with which it deploys and then becomes kind of mass generational. So it used to just be like, you could kind of get up to speed more quickly because you would find like a young person trend, and then you could kind of get up on the curve a little bit. But now it's like, what was cool 6 months ago is now passé and lame. And it's like, to just continue. And that is the biggest thing. And I bang this drum in almost every episode, which is really learning how to flex that thinking muscle. And all of this goes back to the A+I framework. And it is, if we are to control, right, be the pilot of our own futures and not just the passive passenger, we have to challenge our own thinking. And one of the best ways to be able to do that, so you are not deferring to someone else, you're not deferring to something else, and you're not just kind of taking your hands off the wheel and saying, you know what, the future is happening to me. Part of being an active participant in it is challenging your thinking. And that, I think, is the biggest thing around reverse mentorship.
Yeah, and that's right. A great way to challenge your thinking is to expose yourself to the thinking of younger generations of people, much younger than you, and really shake yourself up and understand.
And continually, because
refresh
of that
it. Right.
speed.
So it's not just like a snapshot in time, but that it's a discipline.
It is a
discipline.
discipline.
I talked about before integrating it into the DNA of whatever we're doing. Like, let's say you're running a business, but it's also a discipline that is continuous. And here's the thing. I personally, and I think you would agree with this, I'm much less concerned when we apply this lens to like micro fads. I'm not concerned as much about what the jargon of the day is, because we can have fun doing that game with kids all day long. We do this with our son. It's like, what are the stupid words they're using now that they're not going to be using in 6 months? I'm not as concerned about cultural micro trends or fads. I'm more concerned about broader perspectives on technology, pop culture. It might be influencing their taste in music. We just had a recent episode about the cultural zeitgeist and, you know, comedians like Nate Bargatze and why so many people find that funny, country music. There are things that can be illustrated by understanding how younger people are thinking that inform why those things are happening. And then, oh, look at that. Not by accident, all of a sudden a tapestry starts to form, or we start understanding the world a little bit differently. So you and I are trying to do our part here as a 2-person team, as husband and wife, just trying to figure this out. But I think more people have to have that conversation. Be proactive with your kids. Don't think what they're doing is weird and that what you're doing they don't understand, and what they're doing you don't understand. If your kid is 5, if your kid is 10, if your kid is 20, have these conversations at home, bring them into the workplace.
You don't even need to be a parent.
Right.
It doesn't have to be your kid. Borrow somebody's kid.
No. Listen. Don't take her literally. We're not saying go out there and borrow another kid. Like, you know, let's not advocate for weird things here. But I think, you know, maybe there's a better way we can phrase that. Ask a friend of yours if you can chat with their child for a half an hour and maybe get some perspective instead of borrowing them or taking them.
Borrow their thinking.
In some cases, it's probably better if it's not your own kid. And I agree with that. So we're talking about, you know, having these conversations with our son. We've always joked that your own family members, your own kids have the least patience to discuss these things with you. So I think it might be interesting, you know, you find a niece or a nephew, or you find the kids, again, whatever age they might be, of your best friends. And you just say, you know, can I sit and chat with you for half an hour about the way you see the world? And what do you think is happening with AI? And I think those are interesting conversations to have. And I think ultimately one of the things to understand is that we have this notion, going back to the title of this episode and what we're talking about here, there's this notion of mentorship as a top-down hierarchical thing. And I think that in many ways that's an antique. The world changing the way it is, this is an antiquated, outmoded way of thinking, that everything has to be top-down. That's like a very old model. And it preserves the status quo for people who have lived a long time and have kind of accumulated power, wisdom, and authority. Now, a lot of authority and wisdom is in the, I think, purview of younger people. They're the ones going out there. They're entrepreneurs. They're creators. They're influencing thought. They're influencing society. So why don't we recognize that and realize that one of the cool things about reverse mentorship is that this idea generation, this idea sharing can go two ways. It can go every way imaginable. And that's kind of cool.
Well, so here's the other thing. We can recognize it, but then we actually have to be open to what it is that we hear.
Right.
And I think that's the biggest part. It's like, we can recognize it all the time, be like, yes, like, interesting idea, until we then take those kind of nuggets of wisdom or those things that just change our thinking, change those neural pathways. We have to then do the action piece, right? And then that goes back to agency. We have the ability to then control how we react to something. And if we recognize that they have like an interesting perspective, but we don't actually use it to move the needle at all, then it's just maybe a fun exercise versus something that actually starts strategically changing businesses, starts strategically changing how we approach our lives, our families, our households. And that is in the, like, how can you become more of a doer with that information?
And I think this is going to lead into two different and it's going to happen quickly, two different evolutionary paths. You have a slide that you cover in a lot of your presentations. I love it. It's a visual, simple, that says that a diamond is a lump of coal that did well under pressure. And it's a way to kind of conceive of the fact that, like, you can take two entities, two people, two families, two households, two businesses, and basically apply pressure to both. And one might emerge in a better situation than the other because it responded the appropriate way. I always like to use the example of what happened during the COVID years. And certain businesses and industries thrived because they understood what to do and others stagnated. This is an example. To your point, I think anyone who meaningfully integrates this practice into their DNA and it becomes a discipline, I think they will succeed in the next few years. Those who don't, it's at their own peril. And I think we're going to see that evolutionary differentiation starting to happen in real time.
So to put a bow around a lot of this, here are the key takeaways. Number one, the power of reverse mentorship is in being curious about what is hitting the world of not just Gen Z, but Gen Alpha way before it has even begun to hit yours. Two, to have the curiosity to even want to tap into their thinking. Three, to use it as a way to forget all of the old and outdated knowledge that you are holding on to. And four, to use it as something that becomes an intrinsic guiding principle. Something that you don't just take, but something you use as a catalyst to actually create meaningful change in both your personal and your professional life.
Amen to all of that. I couldn't have said it any better. So thank you for joining us on today's episode. We're going to be back next week, same time, same place. You know where to find us. Please go to our new website, wakethefuture.com, sign up for our mailing list. There's a ton of great content that we distribute there on a regular basis. And as always, I'm going to encourage you to like, follow, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, like, follow, and subscribe to stay ahead of what's next. I'm Erica Orange.
And I'm Jared Weiner. Thanks for waking the future with us. We'll see you next time.